This bodybuilder was so massive that he made Mr. Olympias look like amateurs.
You want to talk mass? Wait when you see Paul Dillette. He's an absolute monster.
And in 1994, he had to be carried off stage due to being so lean that he was cramping too much to move.
It was that bad. No one knew. I never talk about it, right? My heart stopped beating for a minute.
Bodybuilding is a sport dominated by freaky and massive physiques. The bigger and the leaner you are, the better you'll do in competition, and it's no wonder that guys like Ronnie Coleman and Dorian Yates dominated for years during the 90s and early 2000s. We have been seeing freaks in every era since then. Marcus Rule became known in the 90s for being insanely huge and freaky looking while giving questionable diet advice.
Thunfisch, Proteinshake.
And today we have massive guys like Big Ramy and the current Mr. Olympia, Samson Dauda, with super freaks like the recent Nexzilla coming to light on occasion. But what if I told you that there is a single top-level bodybuilder who was much bigger than everyone in his era, and he even competed on the Olympia stage on multiple occasions? The picture you're seeing right now isn't photoshopped. This is a real picture of Canadian bodybuilder Paul Dillette, who received the suiting nickname of Freakenstein during the 1990s and early 2000s. Now, Paul was a unit and a half, standing at 6'2", which is 188 centimeters for non-cheeseburger people, the equivalent to around 3.5 Greg Doucette's, and weighing close to 300 pounds or 140 kilos in competition at his biggest. For reference, that's around 20 pounds heavier than the biggest version of Ronnie Coleman, a whole 10 years before that. And this guy wasn't exactly out of shape either, he was shredded to the bone. And because he was so towering, he could literally stretch his arms out and dwarf virtually everyone on stage. Kevin Levrone? Easy. Flex Wheeler? Paul made him look like he belongs in Classic. Now, Paul Dillette began his career as a bodybuilder in 1991, and he turned pro in 1992, but just 1 year later, he was already competing at the Olympia in 1993, where he ended up placing 6th. Now, everyone always talks about how Dorian Yates changed the game in 1993 by coming in bigger than anyone before him, but nobody ever mentions that this guy came in close to 30 pounds heavier than Dorian and dwarfed absolutely everyone that year. And many thought that Paul Dillette would become the next reigning Mr. Olympia. Now, because Paul was so much taller than all of his competitors and would tower over guys like Dorian Yates, you would expect him to look a bit lanky, but no. His arms were probably the biggest of his era, measuring over 24 inches and looking fuller than Big Lenny's stomach. I would argue his triceps are actually the most impressive throughout that entire era, beating out guys like Kevin Levrone and even Lee Priest. The guy just had a lot of super strong body parts and a teeny tiny waist to boot. But if you look at Paul's competitive history, he never really got the best out in competition. You see, Paul was incredibly well built, but his posing looked like absolute dog shit. Despite dwarfing everyone on stage, he looked a whole lot less impressive when striking a pose. While just standing there, he looked like Mr. Olympia more than anyone else. Paul Dillette had everything you needed to succeed. He had a small waist, he was super massive across the board, he had broad shoulders, he had super lean abs, and even smaller muscles like the calves, forearms, and rear delts were amongst the best of his era. And he even competed during a time where more people were starting to play the size game, a game which he won arguably every single time. But with his posing being as poor as it was, Paul never actually cracked the top 3 at the Mr. Olympia. His best ever placing was number 4 in 1994, and he placed 5th in 96 and 97. So he was never really a true contender for the title, despite being as physically dominant as he was.
In 4th place, competitor number 20, Paul Dillette.
Now, truth to be told, Paul didn't have a great back, like someone else I know, and his lacking ability to showcase his strengths was probably the sole reason why he would never win a very high-level show. He finally managed to win a big show in 1999, being the Night of Champions, which was like the 3rd biggest show in bodybuilding at the time, but at that point, the writing was already on the wall. Paul's physique was already regressing. It was like it was melting away compared to when he made his debut. His massive shoulders, they just disappeared almost overnight, and his midsection, which used to be one of his strong suits, was starting to distend, resembling Mike Israetel's head. So Paul didn't even get a long career at the top. It was brief and ended up with him doing his last Mr. Olympia in 1999, and just a handful of competitions after. Actually, Paul eventually became famous for having one of the largest regressive transformations in bodybuilding. Because he was so freakishly huge and dominant as a competitor, he looked very average when he stopped competing. He didn't maintain a lot of mass like Kevin Levrone, Flex Wheeler, Jay Cutler, etc. He shrunk into a regular dude within just a few months of retirement. Actually, this picture in particular was actually taken during Paul Dillet's career, where he let himself go on purpose just to get back in solid shape within just a few months, showing how strong of a responder to the PEDs and exercise regime he was. Actually, Paul ended up starting his own bodybuilding federation in 2007 called the World Beauty, Fitness and Fashion Contest to judge women's beauty. But looking back at his career, he had a few moments of his own. During the 1994 Arnold Classic, Paul famously froze on stage and he had to be carried off by 4 officials because he cramped up from taking too much diuretics, which caused him to become severely dehydrated.
Very dehydrated.
And looking back at that event, Paul himself said that his coach or guru gave him the wrong type, or at least the wrong dosage of PEDs, and apparently his heart also stopped beating for a whole minute after he was taken off stage.
No one knew. I never talk about it, right? But my heart stopped beating for a minute, for 1 minute, yeah. I was so dry they couldn't even put the IV needle into my veins.
He was also being trained by Mike Menser at some point in his career because Paul was rumored to be pretty lazy with his own training, which eventually caused him to regress despite having some of the best genetics on the planet. Looking back, you can just note how massive he was compared to the rest. And again, those arms are probably some of the biggest of the 1990s, which says a lot knowing how stacked that decade was with guys like Ronnie Coleman.
Status arrested.
Considering his great physique, I think Paul could have done insanely well if he ever mastered his posing. And there are a few pictures of him with Joe Weider, the godfather of bodybuilding, trying to teach Paul how to pose, but it doesn't look like it ever succeeded, as by the end of his career it still looked something like this. But what do you guys think? Could Paul Dillett have been the best bodybuilder of the 1990s, or was he too incomplete to ever beat a guy like Dorian or Ronnie Coleman? Let me know down below in the comments what you guys think, and let me know what sort of videos you all want to see in the future, and I'll see you all next time.